So in this presentation, I'm going to be discussing eco-anxiety and how Lovecraft's fiction has been translated to encapsulate our 21st century fears, focusing on The Sinking City and Call of Cthulhu, the 2015 one. This is very much going to be an introduction, mainly to set up eco-cosmicism. So yeah, I'll just get into it. So it seems as though the eco prefix has been attached onto a variety of genres and modes increasingly over the last few years. And this is largely due to a growing ecological awareness and the anxiety that ensues. To name a few, there's eco-weird, eco-horror, and eco-gothic. Now, I would just like to take a moment here to discuss eco-gothic. So Andrew Smith and William Hughes' seminal work of the same name was published in 2013, and it was the first dedicated study to explore intersections of ecological themes with Gothic fiction. It opened the door for exploring Gothic in terms of environmental degeneration and decline. In their introduction, they state the Gothic seems to be the form which is well placed to capture these anxieties and provides a culturally significant point of contact between literary criticism, eco-critical theory, and political and aesthetic or social terms. So Fred Bottin states that Gothic texts are not good in moral, aesthetic, or social terms. Their concern is with vice. By placing these anxiety-ridden negative themes that plague contemporary audiences at the forefront of their narratives, it can be used for radical or reactionary ends. So it seems that eco-Gothic is a well-chosen genre in which to discuss eco-anxiety in light of climate change, with this concern with degeneration and an emphasis on the need for change. But when discussing Lovecraft, there's a lot of contention surrounding where exactly he sits on the genre scale. And as Gothicists, we know that the boundaries are very easily blurred and transgressed, but for years there's been a reluctance to accept Lovecraft's work as purely Gothic. Bottin states that while Lovecraft's work remains very much aware of the Gothic genre, Gothic forms and effects are too limiting for Lovecraft's mode of writing. Often his work is referred to as weird due to the 1923 founding of pulp magazine Weird Tales, where most of his work was published. There are collections that refer to his work as Gothic, and I've just put David Simmons' New Critical Essays on H.P. Lovecraft down there. That's a fantastic resource for anyone wanting to explore Lovecraft's work through a Gothic lens. But it's partly because of this liminal space which Lovecraft occupies that I've chosen to examine his work and the video games adapted from it through an eco-cosmic lens. Cosmicism was the philosophy which was developed by Lovecraft to encompass the idea that humankind's place on this planet is not a permanent one, and is insignificant in the wider workings of the universe. Given the ramifications of climate change, the effects of which are becoming an almost daily topic, this question of humankind's permanence is constantly brought up and called into question. I think it was just the other day that was it Just Oil or a similar organization threw mashed potatoes over a Monet painting. So it's constantly the discourse is happening on an almost daily basis. So with this in mind, we may say eco-cosmicism is paradoxical as it simultaneously provokes ecocentric anxiety regarding the world and our place on it, while also presenting the idea that actually this doesn't really matter. So the literary theory of cosmicism is therefore naturally synonymous with Lovecraft, but this is not the sole contribution he had to our culture. Though he died in relative obscurity, his influence and popularity has grown exponentially in the years following his death. In the age of Lovecraft, Carl H. Sandholm and Andrew Weinstock unsurprisingly make the assertion that we are living in the age of Lovecraft, whereby his pulp beginnings have assumed an unexpected intellectual and cultural influence. As horror gamers, or at least people interested in horror, we do know the full extent of his influence on horror. So you can see at the bottom here, these are just a few games that were actually recommended to me the other day, and notice all of the Lovecraftian tag on them. It's become a subgenre unto itself, and it all kind of follows the same line. Now, these are just a few, but there's been so many games that have been adapted from, or at least taken influence from Lovecraft's mythos. But it's important to note that there exists a gatekeeping comparable to that which kept the author out of the literary canon and confined to the pulps. There's a plethora of articles and YouTube videos claiming that the games in general are not Lovecraft enough. There's just one at the top there, but you can find so many if you just research or search are there any Lovecraft games, and similar things will come up. Now, this is important to consider when examining adaptations of Lovecraft work because it suggests that video games are so far removed from the source material that they should be categorized differently. But it must be emphasized that, as Linda Heckscher states in A Theory of Adaptation, adaptations are not meant to be pure translations, and adapters are first interpreters. Needless to say, climate change was not a pressing issue in the early 20th century. But contemporary Lovecraftian games are utilizing an eco-cosmic approach into their narratives. And this fan-based criticism follows the same lines as Laura Dong sums up at the bottom there, that to give cosmic beings shape goes against the heart of Lovecraft's fiction. But it's a significant change that marks contemporary concerns. If you've read Call of Cthulhu, you'll know that it opens with the most merciful thing in the world, I think, is the inability of the human mind to correlate all of its contents. But as a species faced with eventual destruction, these old gods are acting as manifestation of contemporary concerns, where the unknown is becoming known. Destruction is a almost daily reality. The Sinking City and Call of Cthulhu are two such games which make ecological themes a forefront of their narratives, and they don't leave it up to the player to decide whether the developers wanted them to be Lovecraftian. Before the player even enters the games, they directly relate themselves to the mythos. Call of Cthulhu with a quote from the temple down the bottom there, and the Sinking City with a disclaimer, which we'll go into just a bit. And just as a side note, it's worth mentioning that any Lovecraftian game doesn't tend to be a pure adaptation from one single story. Usually it's an amalgamation of all different stories. But most often it's Call of Cthulhu and the Shadow of Ringsmouth that are the most popular and recognizable stories. Skip one. So Lovecraft's racial views is yet another contested discussion, but it's one that's happening more frequently, especially in the wake of the Black Lives Matter movement. While the first biography by L. Sprague de Camp doesn't mention his racial views at all, prominent Lovecraft scholar S.T. Joshi has long since argued that Lovecraft's writing must be kept separate from the author, often going on the attack should anyone draw these views into light. Just for one example, there was the World Fantasy Awards decision to scrap the bust of Lovecraft. Joshi called it a craven yielding to the worst sort of political correctness. The racist themes of Lovecraft's work are an important discussion and one that I can't give due attention to in this presentation. So what does this have to do with eco-cosmicism? For one, it demonstrates that Lovecraft's fiction was not purely based on incomprehensible gods beyond the reaches of human understanding. In gamifying fictions of defeat, Joseph Garrard argues that the things which frighten Lovecraft's protagonists are drawn from Lovecraft's own terrors. It shows that he incorporated what he believed to be pressing issues. Just to quote The Shadow of Ringsmouth here, just what foreign blood was in him I could not even guess. I myself would have thought of biological degeneration. So Lovecraft was extremely concerned with what he saw as biological degeneration or mixing of races. And if you were to read the majority of Lovecraft's texts, it incorporates some of this idea that races shouldn't mix. There's two schools of thought whether Lovecraft was a product of its time or whether he was inherently bigoted. But again, that's a discussion for another presentation. So the Sinking City takes place after the events of the Shadow of Ringsmouth. It follows private investigator Charles Reed as he travels to the fictional city of Oakmont to find the source of the visions that he and his others have been experiencing. These visions lead to eventual insanity. Once he arrives, he finds the inhabitants facing the aftermath of the flood, which has left much of the city submerged underwater. So already we have a tentative link towards the Gothic, as it were, or cosmicism, and anxiety, eco-anxiety. With this flood brought the wild beasts. Instead of tentacle, pulpy masses that become associated with Lovecraft, they are human in appearance, if horribly mutated, as you can see here. This thus connoting the idea that humanism is directly linked to environmental destruction. If we look at Lovecraft's original story, it was the Innsmouthers who were the violent antagonists who hunted down the narrator. In the Sinking City, they are much more humanized, even to the point that the first quest is to find out what happened to an aristocrat's son. When you find out Innsmouther kills him, He tells you that he has experienced the same visions as you have and seems deeply regretful. And the developers also incorporated the KKK into their narrative, which at times pose as much threat as the monsters. So the game really makes the cosmic horrors very real and brings them down to a human level, marking them with human concern and anxiety. Call of Cthulhu's protagonist is also a private investigator named Edward Pierce, and he attempts to uncover the strange case of Sarah Hawkins. She was an artist who supposedly went mad before she and her family perished in a fire. He travels to Darkwater to find this out, and he finds that the locals are themselves as strange as the case. The player is given a couple of objectives once they reach the shore, one being to head to the stranded whale bar just to the right and talk to the barman. To the left, however, there's a crowd of fishermen and police surrounding the carcass of a whale. And this whale carcass appears to have been attacked by something much larger than it. Worrying though this may be, it only becomes clear, and the significance only becomes clear once you visit the bar. It is revealed that the town had a prosperous whaling economy. Upon talking to NPC bar patrons, there's the option to ask, what brought whaling to an end? To which they reply, the whales, of course. Pierce makes the observation, you exhausted the stocks, thereby representing the way in which hunting was seen as a commodity and whales' lives seen as a commodity. With the popularity of Netflix documentary Seaspiracy, many people have been made aware of the dire consequences of overfishing and bycatches in which whales, dolphins, and sharks are killed unnecessarily. Further probing finds out that the whales were hunted to near extinction. The inhabitants of Darkwater faced starvation until the miraculous catch. A whale of gargantuan proportions saved them. Okay, so there you can see on the left is the whale, and on the right is the stranded whale bar. The dead whale on the shoreline becomes a more ominous sign then. In the end chapters of the game, you find that the miraculous catch was actually an old god known as the Leviathan. Sorry about the spoiler, but it is kind of filtered in throughout the narrative. And those who consumed its flesh, or descended from those who consumed its flesh, are now part of the cult that want to unleash Cthulhu onto the world. Thus, the beginning of the game situates the player in a sort of in-between realm. The dead whale at the left of the bar representing the present and depicting the future. The bar on the right acts as a monument of the past. A misguided glory in which the inhabitants have become brainwashed to believing that they should be exhausting these stocks, that they should be commodifying these animals. By linking whaling as a means to bringing the old god Cthulhu out of his slumber and thereby the world's destruction, the eco and cosmic are clearly linked. So these games utilize eco-anxiety as a mobilizing theme, which was not wholly present in Lovecraft's time. Perhaps The Color of the Space was an exception in where he incorporated these eco-anxious narratives. The Color of the Space being where a meteor falls to Earth and poisons the surrounding crop and farmland. It's also important to consider the mode of video games. There's a detachment from narrator and reader in Lovecraft's tales, with them often being unnamed. There's not really a symbiotic relationship then. Through video games, however, the player is given agency. And there's a relationship between the player, and Richard Rouse examines this, remarking that we fear for the character because we emphasize for the character, but also because we need to keep the character in good health in order to pursue the same goals. So the criticism that there are no Lovecraftian games because these cosmic horrors are made real and are given shape doesn't really exist in the 21st century setting. The monsters of Lovecraft's fiction escape definition with the exception of Cthulhu, who was described as a mixture of an octopus, a dragon, and a human caricature. And Bernard Behrens discusses the agency afforded by video games, stating that the gamer is urged to act and feel through its present agency and embodiment in the fictional world. The survival genre extends these bodily sensations. So the playable character is an extension of the player. In the case of these two games particularly, with Call of Cthulhu, there are, I believe, 5 different endings, and the player's decisions throughout the game impacts which ending they get. Whereas with the Sinking City, you are able to choose from 3 endings, so you're able to see what ending you will have and what impact this will have to the rest of the plot. The playable character and the gamer become complicit in the actions they take, instead of passive, becoming a reactive participant, thereby mimicking the eco-anxiety pervading our society. So, though Lovecraft's monsters are far beyond the reach of our understanding, they have been remediated to turn the gaze inwards. Video game developers linking the mundane with the cosmic in an attempt to prod at our own eco-anxiety and the dire consequences of human activity. I'm aware that I kind of sped through that, and I'm sorry if I stumbled. I've got a bit of a sore throat today. But yeah, thank you for listening, and I want to say a huge thank you to Steph for putting together this conference as well.